Hey, everybody. Great to see you all tonight. So, Nick, you're back after quite an absence. We've missed you so much. You've moved to North Dakota and you're undertaking a PhD program in meteorology. So, can you catch us up to what you've been up to, Nick? It's great to see you again.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been a while. It's a PhD in emergency management, but yeah, it's been very busy. Yeah, moving here was a process, and into July, beginning of August, you know, and then actually preparing to go to school. I started school on August 23rd, and then actually doing trying to get used to being in school again for the first time in like what has it been 5 years? So it's definitely been a
Wow.
process, but it's working out pretty well for me so far.
Yeah. How do you like your course of study that you're doing at the university? And what is the name of the university that you're currently enrolled in?
Yeah, I'm at North Dakota State University in Fargo. Um, um,
No Fargo
so yeah,
jokes, right?
PhD in emergency management. It's going very well so far. No Fargo jokes. Right. Yeah, it's kind of cool though. It's one of the reasons I wanted to go here was because it's only a few hours away from Minneapolis, and I have a lot of family that live in the Minneapolis metro area, so it's only about 3 hours away drive.
Oh, that's
So
great.
I can be a little closer to my mom, yeah, and my grandparents and uncles, a bunch of my uncles and aunt and cousins live in that all in that area, so I can be closer to them and be able to see them when I want to or need to. And um, yeah, it is. It's been a good experience so far. I've been doing a lot. I'm taking 3 classes. I'm involved in a on a research team for a study, and then I'm doing starting to already do some research on a possible dissertation topic, and then I'm
Really?
applying
You've
for
already chosen that. What are you
internship. I
tending
got
towards
a
to?
yeah
Let me let me guess. Does this have something to do with
yeah. So
abrupt climate change?
it it definitely could. Um, uh, Basically, I'm looking at or my area of interest that I'm going to try to sort of figure out what I want to do more specifically for research. It involves uh, an issue of risk communication. In in meteorology and um, other uh, other fields, one of the biggest issues is trying to warn people of hazards and hazard events that are
Right.
immediate, threatening, or in progress, and that's through the communication of warnings. And one of the interests I have, and I've had for a long time, is how those warnings get uh, communicated to populations, and specifically um, issues with vulnerable populations, populations that have more difficulty either
Right.
understanding or being able to respond to those warnings because of issues in social vulnerability. So it could be language barriers, there could be socioeconomic issues where they don't have the resources to be able to respond, or they may have disabilities or other um, barriers that make it difficult to even receive warnings like that. And obviously, as severe weather events, extreme weather events become more intense and more frequent because of climate change and other things like that, it's going to be more important than ever to be able to um, accurately communicate warnings of impending threats to people that have more difficulty in society understanding and responding to those threats. Because when you have disasters, one of the biggest things with um, disasters is that they create um, um, they create needs. They cause impacts, damage, injury, death,
Mhm.
things like that. But they also cause needs that weren't in existence pre-disaster. So obviously, you have a disaster. People need food. People need shelter because they lost their homes. People need medical care. There's all these needs that crop up in the population. But if you already have pre-existing needs that are being unmet because of issues of social vulnerability, then a disaster event that disrupts um, normal social systems
Mhm.
exposes all of those pre-existing needs, and the new needs that come up from the disaster itself exacerbate the issues that were occurring pre-disaster. So that's one of the things that I really want to look at is not only how warnings are crafted and communicated, and there's a lot of research into that, but also more into the social um, variables, that actually involve people, and sometimes their inability to either understand or respond to warning information. So that's sort of what I'm looking at, digging into the research to figure out where
Mhm.
there are gaps in existing research to be able to build on that in future in studies that would be put into a dissertation. So that's what I'm looking at right now.
Mhm. Are you going to, factor in abrupt climate change events? For example, as lately as, February of 2021 in Houston, or was it Dallas, where all the electrical equipment froze, and, I guess it was more in the natural gas equipment, it wasn't winterized, right? And because of the
Yeah,
dipping of the jet stream, because the jet streams become so long and wavy and irregular and getting stuck and stuff like that, so this body of cold, cold air, went squarely over, was it Dallas or Houston? Do you remember? I think it
it
was
was much
Dallas.
of Texas. Yeah, it was much of
Most
Texas
of
that got
Texas,
impacted
that
by
was,
that.
like, in February.
Yeah,
I mean, if people would just understand that abrupt climate change events mean colder winters in North America, and hence, because the jet stream dropped so squarely into Texas and just stayed there, it froze it, and none of the equipment there, was winterized to that extent.
yeah, yeah. The thing with climate change is that it creates um, um, either it can create new phenomenon for a region, or it can new hazard agents for a region, or it can uh, exacerbate the existing ones. So you get, say, uh, bigger dips in the jet stream, colder weather, you get more heat
Mhm.
waves, you get more frequent tropical cyclones, and so that over a long period of time will expose pre-existing social vulnerabilities in the population. I remember during that Texas event, some of the deaths that occurred from the cold were in elderly people that lived alone. They
Mm.
didn't have, you know, one of the biggest issues with dealing with hazard events is if people don't have a um, a social network to turn um, to to check on them, to even tell them something is coming. They're more at risk than people that have more abundant social networks and understand what's going on and having a greater awareness of what's happening and have an understanding of how to respond to it. So you have these technological failures where they didn't winterize the equipment properly and do things to prepare the system, and therefore uh, better protect the people from the hazards of the cold. And because you end up having electrical failures that expose people to cold that wouldn't have been exposed otherwise if it maintained itself. But then on top of it, you had failures that came from these pre-existing vulnerabilities where people were unable to um, respond and protect themselves or have assistance from others that could help them. And I mean with and I mean that's a an ongoing uh, and known issue with climate change in general. You know, it creates or enhances hazards in the climate
Mhm.
system and in the weather, and the people that are most at risk are those that have the greatest vulnerabilities. They live near coastlines, they're poor, they don't have the ability to just up and leave, or their countries themselves, their communities are too poor to be uh, to mitigate against future events. Mitigate meaning reduce or eliminate the risk. So, you know, I remember one scientist some years ago saying in a documentary about climate change and stuff like that, and sea level rise. Well, we can't dike the whole planet. You know, you can have these really big cities like New York that talk about, oh, we're going to build, you know, in the future we could build these floodgates and these big expensive structures. Well, there's a lot of poor countries that can't do that kind of stuff. You
Mhm.
know, they can't do
That's
those kind
true.
of things to try to reduce the risk. They're just exposed, and they either are, you know, they're either somehow have to move somewhere else, you know, climate refugees, or they're screwed, you know, to the mercy of of the sea level rise and really the extreme storms that will come and that will be have worse storm surges because of sea level rise. I mean, a classic example would be Bangladesh, for example. Lots of people
That's what I was
who are,
thinking of. I mean, I'm
live
sure
in
you've
shallow areas. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen a lot of that footage with, Bangladesh, with the poor people who are just right there. I mean, Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, is quite a bit further north up the delta, but right on the, coast, that's where they've been, raising rice and all their crops. It's very fertile land because it's part of the river delta, so it's got lots of nutrients, and it's been some of the most fertile land in Bangladesh, and you can just see vast swaths of that just pouring off every time they have one of these abrupt climate change events. The rice paddies are just flowing away. Have you seen some of that footage?
I haven't I haven't seen the footage, but I can believe it. I mean, it's
Yeah,
that
pretty
region
amazing.
in particular is pretty exposed to, you know, big flood events, storm surge events. They have a history of events that have killed lots of people, and I actually for my research read a paper about some of the things that Bangladesh and India are trying to do with warning communication and trying to figure out how to better assist people to deal with those disasters. But obviously, um, with time, those disasters may, you know, will get worse as you get, you know, storms that have a tendency
Yeah,
to either become more frequent or become stronger. And, you know, um, it becomes challenging to figure out how to reduce the risk to people, either through, you know, building things or moving people away, which in some cases may be the only option if your land is going underwater. It's just becoming not viable to live because you're having consecutive disaster events that cause so much damage. You never really have a chance to recover. You know, recovery.
no,
You know, emergency management, we talk about preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation. Preparedness is sort of defensive in nature, where you're trying to that you're accepting something's going to come in the future, and so you try to plan for that. And then response is actually dealing with a hazard event that's imminent or in progress. And then recovery is trying to not only, preferably, not just rebuild or return to a normal state, but actually reshape your the way you did things to try to make it better than it was before, if possible. And then mitigation is trying to actually reduce long term strategies, reduce the risk um, from events in the future. And one of the things that doesn't get focused on is the recovery side of things. How do you do things, repair and rebuild, but also reduce these issues with um, social vulnerability and physical vulnerability so that you could have things better than they were before. And I mean, that's going to be a real challenge with abrupt climate change, because you're fighting against not only trying to um, deal with the issues that were before, but then you're getting hazard events that are getting progressively more, either more frequent or more intense, and it's harder
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
recover from that, especially if you're getting events that are becoming more frequent and more intense and causing more damage, and you have to try to recover from those while you're recovering from what happened previously in a short amount of time. So it's it becomes more it's going to be a huge challenge in emergency management, thinking about
Yeah.
how do you recover, and if there's a point where recovery becomes impossible. And it's something that's discussed. I mean, we talk about that in one of my courses. There can be points when recovery isn't guaranteed. You may never get to a state even that you were before, let alone reshape it to make it better. And and abrupt climate change certainly poses a risk for that, for communities around the world that don't have the resources or the ability to tackle the things that are happening now and what's coming because of these rapid rises in global temperature, and the effects it has on the climate system, from food to
Mhm.
storms to other resources, water availability, all those resources that you need to have a stable society.
Yeah. Um, Nick, let's turn the conversation to the Arctic and Arctic amplification and the consequences of Arctic amplification and how it's linked to abrupt climate change events and basically the condition of the Arctic and what we might be able to expect in the future. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, um, the Arctic, it varies year to year, but the long term trend continues to be this progressive loss of sea ice, the loss of permafrost, um, and both of those have impacts on the atmosphere. Classic, issue with the loss of sea ice is the loss of the albedo effect, where you have bright white ice that reflects more sunlight. You lose more ice on average year to year. That allows more blue ocean, which dark blue ocean, darker colors absorb more solar radiation emitted as heat than um, white surfaces, lower albedo versus higher albedo, and that warms the Arctic rapidly. And that warming also is affecting the land permafrost, where you have loss of permafrost. Some people call it permamush, where you get the melting of the landscape, and that releases carbon into the atmosphere by um, uh, all of the carbon that's locked up in the permafrost is exposed. You get thaw slumping, where the land just slumps and exposes, permafrost melts, exposes dead animals and other organic material that's been locked up in that permafrost. It literally just rots and releases carbon in the form of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So, which also can exacerbate climate change. So, um, this has multiple implications. I mean, one of the big ones is that scientists like Francis and even Michael Mann and others have discussed, is this altering of the jet stream pattern through that rapid warming of the Arctic. So you get these big amplification of waves patterns, where you get the jet stream going very far north, so it brings in warmer air from the mid latitudes into the Arctic, which in these very um, um, warm events, Arctic heat waves, if you will, to the Arctic, which can um, cause more melting of ice, or even in the dead of winter, you can get these big storms that come out of the mid latitudes, impact Greenland, impact the Arctic sea ice, bring very warm temperatures for the time of year, January, February. We've seen that happen several years in a row. So you get like um, so even in January, melting or cracking of ice and north of Greenland in February. Very crazy stuff. But of course, you get these big dramatic dips southward or equatorialward in the jet stream as well that produce these um, very cold events. And I know that there's still debates among some scientists about how much that's playing a role. I know this has been a big debate. Some people argue with um, Jennifer Francis about it, but um, it at least has some intuitive uh, uh, connection to atmospheric dynamics, um, and I mean that February cold wave was crazy. I mean, it got down to -31 or -33 Fahrenheit in Lincoln, Nebraska, back when I was in Nebraska
Mhm.
in February, in the morning hours. And of course, farther north you are, the more accustomed they are to that kind of cold. It was very cold for Nebraska standards, but not necessarily for North Dakota. But you go to Texas, they had very cold weather. And as we just discussed, they didn't have your equipment weatherized. They had, a lot of uh, technological vulnerabilities that led to the disaster down there with the power grid and all the impacts that resulted from that. So, and I mean, this wavy jet stream can lead to um, big heat waves in the summertime. Can lead to some of the cold waves in the winter. Um, so, I mean, it's a major player. The jet stream is a major player in weather and mid latitudes. If you have it sort of
Mhm.
destabilized like that, and climate change playing a role in that, that can have big impacts on people, and that depend on the climate to have some sort of stable state. Individuals that depend on it, and but also people that and governments and industries, agriculture that depend on some stability in order to thrive. So, yeah, it's a big thing.
One thing I'd like to address is the level of honesty in the scientific community about the magnitude of Arctic amplification. Recently, I think last week sometime, Paul Beckwith released a new video in which he was reviewing a peer reviewed paper. And the first sentence on that peer reviewed paper said a complete lie. They said the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world due to Arctic amplification. That's not true. And there have been many studies about Arctic amplification. And the truth is that it's much worse than that by about 150%. The Arctic is warming 4 to 5 times faster than the rest of the world, which will make these abrupt climate change events that much worse. And another thing that Paul Beckwith did was he calculated the amount that we've warmed as a world since the Industrial Revolution. And I think you can count from 1750 or so or thereabouts. And he came up with 2 degrees Celsius that we've warmed thus far as a world. Wondering if you can comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, the thing with um, uh, science is that um, sometimes, well, the thing with science is that it can be, there's this issue of in debate about how, what data to include in methods of studies, and how conservative you should be versus how open you should be, which can depend on what you're trying to communicate. And and particularly if it deals with issues of risk. And I know that 2 degrees C warm faster than the rest of the world. Some of that comes from uh, how much of the arc how much how big of land area or area of the Arctic they're using. Because if you use like a really broad area of so northern hemisphere, you call that the Arctic. um, Obviously the southern portions of that aren't warming as fast as the interior portion, so you might get that 2 degrees, where if you look at more the interior Arctic, you know, 70, 80 degrees latitude and farther north, it's warming much faster than the areas to the south. Uh, so there's kind of disparities based on that. And then also, some scientists don't like to use or depend so much on the proxy data going back to 1750, because basically before the mid 19th century, early 19th century, we didn't have widespread use of thermometers and to measure temperature uh,
Mm.
accurately. So they use proxy data going back farther than that. Some scientists don't like to use that because they don't think the reliability of that proxy data is good. So they will reject that and assume that the way things were in the mid 19th century approximate the way it was in the mid 18th. Whereas if you use 18th century data, proxy data, then you may get a temperature that was cooler than that time, but it has more uncertainty because you're using proxy data, you're not using direct measurements. So there's debate on that too. So um, I, you know, knowing some of these or having interactions with some of these scientists, I tend to not believe it's so much dishonesty as is disagreements over what data to use, how to use it, and the reliability of it. That tends to be the biggest argument scientists have with each other. Is should this data be used? How accurate is it? How reliable is it? You know, and what and how should it be applied. Those are tend to be the biggest arguments scientists have with each other on these kind of topics, especially quantitative focused scientists that deal with hard data and measurements. They get they will argue a lot on this, and those arguments sometimes go in peer review papers. Sometimes those arguments go um, at conferences where they argue amongst themselves. So I've seen that stuff happen in real time, and that's usually what it's about. And predominant the predominant voice in the scientific community will typically be on the more conservative side. But then you have to honestly think, is that appropriate? You know, I would tend to think if we're going to use proxy data going back many hundreds of years to understand what the climate was leading up to the present time, it's perfectly appropriate to apply it to understanding, okay, this is how it was in the mid 18th century, so we can just attach it. And then we have data that's more reliable with thermometers going to more recent time, and we understand the change that occurred in a more accurate way. And it could very well be we're closer to 2 degrees than we think. But I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't get to argue that. But yeah, that's typically what's going on in the scientific community's arguments over that kind of stuff.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Another topic that I've been interested in lately is sudden stratospheric warming, and it is being seen almost kind of like a lava lamp or something like that, that areas of the stratosphere are becoming suddenly very, very hot. And the stratospheric vortex, polar vortex, is becoming misshapen and kind of elongated, and that's affecting the jet stream as well because it's connected to the jet stream. Have you been hearing about sudden stratospheric warming?
I've heard of it. I'll admit I'm not as adept at it as maybe other people are. Um, I the last I heard, which was really a couple years ago, there was still a lot of debate about if sudden stratospheric warming was being actually made more frequent by climate change. There's a lot of understanding of how climate change is affecting
Yeah.
the troposphere, because obviously a lot of the greenhouse gases accumulate in the troposphere, and the warming, much of the warming is in the troposphere. Actually, the stratosphere on average is getting colder because the troposphere is getting warmer because the greenhouse gases are acting as a blanket, literally a blanket to trap that heat in the lower
Mhm.
atmosphere, the troposphere, as we call it. But it would be, I hope there's more research going on into whether the sudden stratospheric warming is being influenced or more to become more frequent or more intense because of climate change. Because those kind of events, you get um, the splitting of the polar vortex, which can obviously alter the jet stream pattern. And that change in the jet stream pattern, the change in the stratosphere, then is reflected in the troposphere, the lower part of the atmosphere, with bigger waves in the jet stream that occur later on. That's typically what happens when you get those sudden stratospheric um, warming events. And obviously, if you're getting climate change that's making them more frequent, then that makes those issues with um, the amplification of the jet stream that's already being affected by the melting of the sea ice at the surface of the Earth, so potentially more frequent and can cause more extreme weather events. So that's certainly something that would be worthy of further research, and I'm sure that there are climate scientists that are looking into that, but I haven't personally heard anything further on that in recent months.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I was watching some videos by Paul Beckwith lately, and he was talking about these sudden stratospheric warming events that are underway right now. And what they're seeing is that a tremendous amount of warmth is being transferred from the Tibetan Plateau, since that's one of the highest big points of Earth. And the Tibetan Plateau itself is very high, which is also getting much hotter. And, and it just more easily uh, can somehow bubble up to the stratosphere, and a lot of heat is entering the stratosphere. And the stratosphere itself has a polar vortex, and that polar vortex is starting to manifest a lot of the same characteristics that we're seeing here in the troposphere polar vortex, right? We're seeing that it's
Mhm.
splitting, it's becoming elongated. And the stratospheric polar vortex is more like a football. It's not like quite as, exciting as the polar vortex and the troposphere, but they're
Yeah.
seeing that it is really becoming very misshapen, and that when you have these abrupt climate change events, they are it's the troposphere and the stratosphere both are involved in that, because it's not really separate layers. We just call them separate layers, right? It's one big thing. And it's kind of interesting what's happening up in the stratosphere. So guys, watch some of Paul Beckwith's latest videos that he's put out. They're very, very interesting. And I believe he's over at COP26 right now. Is that still going on, Nick? COP26?
I have not been able to track what's going on with COP26. Let me see actually when it's going to end. I'm kind of curious about it.
Hmm.
Oh, it actually starts on Halloween. So, but people are going there now, I'm sure, because it's like a week before. But yeah, it
That's what
starts
it
on
is.
Halloween.
Yeah.
Of all the days it would start,
Oh,
it's kind of
wow.
funny. Yeah,
Oh,
it starts on
wow.
Halloween.
That's
It ends
very
on November
funny.
12th.
I wonder
Yeah.
if people are going to be wearing their witch hats and their masks and stuff like that. That would be funny. You should, man. I mean,
Yeah,
oh,
unfortunately, I'm not. I'm not expecting much out of COP 20, COP 26. Like these cops, in emergency management, um, there's a big thing about disaster planning, and there's this funny sort of meme where the biggest thing to do with like preparing and for disaster events and stuff is like collaboration and coordination. People actually like of different interests and backgrounds and needs actually like interacting with each other, talking to each other, establishing relationships, so that when there's a disaster, people and organizations can actually like interact with each other, know what they're doing and what each other are doing, and able to have active communication and have more effective response and recovery. Um, but if they don't do that, somebody just drafts a plan, a really fancy plan on paper. It's called a paper plan. It means absolutely nothing. One of my professors was like, I could draft a really fancy paper plan of how everyone should be involved in this way or that way to deal with a disaster and to recover from it and do all this and everything else. It'd be nice and pretty, and it can sit in someone's someone's office and gather dust because nobody would care about it. And that's pretty much what happens with cops. I mean, everyone
Mhm.
drafts these ideas and grand plans, and but it's all about like political optics. Nobody actually actively does anything to even attempt to either um, deal with these challenges or talk about the difficulties or maybe challenges that are insurmountable, and how do we um, help the most vulnerable people. I mean, the most vulnerable countries in these cops get screwed all the time. They don't.
Mm.
Some of these very vulnerable countries, the sea level rise or to droughts, they want very aggressive things to be done by the wealthier countries. And the wealthier countries, they write all these nice pretty things on paper, but they don't want to
Mhm.
do any of them. They don't want to give any money to the poorer nations to help them out with mitigation ideas or whatever adaptation ideas, and yet the wealthier nations have done most of the damage via their greenhouse gas emissions and all of the resources that they've burned up on very on high affluent living, and etc. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's great on paper, but it's not very useful in practice. I I had to look up
Yeah.
when the cop was happening because I wasn't even paying attention to it.
One thing, there are a lot of people in the South Pacific, like Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Fiji, all these South Pacific islands, especially the ones that are primarily coral, non-volcanic, and that are more
Yeah,
flat. And they're very close to the sea, like the Solomon Islands and Tonga and the Marshall Islands and things like that. They're only like couple of feet above sea level, and those islands are very flat. So, as the sea progressively rises and it's rising faster and faster, we're going to have a wave of emergencies that are all going to be striking at the same time as all these people that are at sea level are trying to contend with the salt infusing their aquifers. I mean, it doesn't even have to hit their homes necessarily. There's a lot of other things that they'll be connected to, right? And
yeah,
Kiribati has already been trying to move off of their island to Fiji, to other places, and a lot of people don't want to take the refugees, which is what pretty much what they are, is climate refugees. So, that pretty much goes hand in hand, Nick, with what you've been working on in your personal interests to mitigate and help and assist basically the downtrodden in this climate casino.
yeah. I mean, that's one of the issues um, in emergency management, like in like acute disasters. People tend to be very pro-social and altruistic. This has been shown time and time again in research going back to the 1950s when they were. trying to figure out how people respond to nuclear, attacks and stuff like that. How do people respond in very intense acute disasters? But it's different in what we could call complex humanitarian emergencies, where you have ongoing problems that are produced by um, um, politics, produced by social strife. I mean, this can be, as a result of wars or internal conflicts. And unfortunately, I'm noticing, that, climate change may be more capable of producing these kind of complex humanitarian emergencies because um, climate change isn't an acute event. It's something that's occurring ongoing. You have these events that occur within the specter of climate change that are being caused by climate change, these abrupt climate change events. But the long term struggle of losing your land because of the rising sea, of losing your agriculture to drought, it produces all these other effects that are political and social in nature, and people want to, um, will cause will have conflicts with their governments internally, or they will move out of their zone and move somewhere else, and suddenly the altruism can kind of drop off. I mean, we saw this uh, with Syria, where they had the major drought in, I believe it was the late 2000s or 2010, and it preceded, caused social crisis that preceded the civil war there, and
Yeah.
you've had lots of people that were trying to get out to go to other places to escape the warfare and the starvation and other issues, and other countries didn't want to let them in because it wasn't seen as their problem. There wasn't in this altruism and pro-social behavior, because suddenly it's like, oh, us, that's them. I don't want to deal with them, and that could be a big problem, especially on the international stage, where people are in normal times are divvied up by their country and their culture, and they don't want to let in somebody else because they perceive them as a threat to their culture, to their economy, to their, I mean, whatever,
Mhm.
whatever it happens to be. I mean, we saw this. Um, I've heard some of this with Afghan refugees. They're escaping a war that the United States was started. Basically the in Afghanistan, and some Americans were like, I don't want to let in the Afghan refugee. It's so those kind of
Mhm.
climate change can cause those kind of issues, those kind of conflicts and strife, um, because of the slow creep, which it's not really that slow. But for the human mind, it seems slow, but it takes over very quickly, and before you know it, you have people that are in serious dire need, and they can't get the help that they need from other people that happen to be in other parts of the world where they're not dealing with, at least in that time, a crisis themselves. So that's gonna be big, as climate change worsens. Is how kind are people going to be to other people that are in need, especially from these countries that are much more vulnerable to the rising sea or to drought. When we're seeing major drought,
Mhm.
I have heard about the major drought going on in Madagascar, for example. That's been
Mm.
heavily blamed on climate change. Um, and they're dealing with a lot of food scarcity there. Obviously, Yemen's been another major um, place of food scarcity. Some of it could be climate change related, some of it obviously is related to how other nations like Saudi Arabia are dealing with them in terms of their ability to get resources
Mhm.
into Yemen. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's uh, uh, going to be a major issue, and that's kind of stuff is not really talked about. These cops dealing with, you know, cooperation to actually help people that are the most vulnerable. They get left behind. They always get left behind.
Yeah. Well, that's the way it always seems to be. The poor people are one to feel the hardest effects of abrupt climate change, and it all just depends if you happen to be living in an area that's vulnerable. And, the climate casino, you just don't know where it's gonna strike next. So
Yeah,
that's the problem.
yeah, definitely. Yep.
So what else is going on, Nick? What are you thinking about, and what have you been, besides the mitigation efforts?
Nothing. Well, I mean, I, as far as me, um, personally, it's been um, mostly just trying to like soak in everything I'm learning and sort of connect it. I find my background in meteorology has definitely given me um, a different perspective on these issues because I I've always looked at you know hazards, especially obviously weather hazards, from a physical perspective. About the hazard itself, its characteristics, and in weather forecasting, we're concerned to some degree about how it affects people because the whole point of forecasting the weather is to give people information to be able to um, uh, live their lives. But actually, going into emergency management, which has a heavy dose of sociology in it, um, I get a perspective where I actually am able to understand, how people behave, how they deal with hazards, the challenges that they face with hazards, and and what they do well, what they don't do so well, and how they behave as not just a bunch of individuals, but as a collective, as organizations, as households, as communities, and communities can be defined in many different ways. A person can be a member of multiple different communities, and the and how they compete with each other and how they interact with each other and how that affects when you have these hazard events, how they able to then relate to each other in different norms that occur post disaster versus pre disaster, and also learn how governments um, perceive people, because um, governments are very hierarchical, they're very bureaucratic, they're very strict and stale. They don't like change, and they like to command and control people. And people um, aren't even in very authoritarian societies aren't ones to be easily controlled. So you know it's a matter of trying to change the culture of how governments function to actually care about these issues related to how people behave and help them be more successful at um, responding and recovering from disasters instead of trying to control them or blame them. Because obviously governments and politicians, they don't like to accept blame for things, and so they just blame the people. People didn't understand what they were doing. They didn't heed our warnings. It's their fault. It's not our fault. Power tends to not accept responsibility for things, and so it's been very interesting. Even being in this program for only like 9 weeks, 10 weeks to really get a sense of those important issues, and obviously, we talk about a lot about climate change on this show. Um, those things are going to matter more as as the years progress and we hit these more extreme events. you know People are still living, people are still interacting with each other. They still um, These disparities in how people are exist. Some people are wealthier than others, some people are poorer than others. You have issues with systemic racism, um, um, ethnic groups that get marginalized, and it matters. It's going to matter more into the you know how these events impact society and to those people that are the most vulnerable and the least able to respond and recover from those disasters. So I think I'm doing something that really resonates with me, um,
Mhm.
and
That's
doing
important.
important work.
That's
I
really
mean,
important.
and I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the future holds. I mean, are we going to is civilization could collapse. We could face extinction. We continue on the path that we're going, but in the meantime, we're here, and so in the meantime, we as people do things, and you can either do things better to the best of our ability with the resources that we got in the environment that we're facing, or we do nothing and more people suffer faster and sooner than they had to otherwise. So I think
Mhm.
we should do the former, not the latter.
Yeah, I agree, I agree. Well, Nick, it sounds like you've kind of decided to be useful to society and share your awareness with others and, get an advanced degree,
Yes.
you know? Why not? Why not?
Yes. Yeah. Why not? Yeah. It can be a little intimidating, but I mean, I'm in a very supportive program. It's kind of
Mm,
tight knit. I'm one of four or five, I can't remember, I think five
yes.
PhD students in the program. I think I'm the only one from the United States. We have very, in the PhD cohort, we have a very diverse group. One person's from Thailand, another's from the Bahamas, another one is from Nigeria. So yeah, it's nice to be around um, um, others that have different perspectives based on the lives that they've lived and the culture that they faced.
Mhm.
So, so yeah,
Yeah.
it's been uh, it's been good. My son's running in here. That's my son yelling.
Hi. Hi, guys.
Hey, hi.
Hi.
Say hi.
Hi.
Yeah, he's trying to
Yeah,
get to bed, so
mm, yeah.
that's funny. But
Well, there
yeah,
was a
and yeah,
comment
my
that I
family's
have.
doing good. So yeah, they've
Oh, that's
yeah,
good.
been very
That's
supportive.
good. That's good. There was a comment that came in down here. Isn't it building a wall on their border with Bangladesh? They know what's coming. They do. And thank you very much, Jonquil Jones, for your comment there. And as Nick and I were discussing Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is an incredibly densely populated nation, and they border India,
Yeah,
and as the sea levels continue to rise, they just naturally start migrating more northerly, right? North, 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 because the southern part of their
yeah,
country is becoming inundated, really seriously. And India
yeah,
is building a wall on their border. So they want to keep those people out, you know, just like we've built
yeah.
a
I mean,
wall with Mexico, India's building a wall with Bangladesh. So do you have anything to say
yeah,
about that?
yeah. I mean, that's exactly the issue. I mean, they see a future complex humanitarian emergency, and then complex humanitarian emergencies, people have different that are outside of the the effects of the hazard or the disorder that's causing the emergency don't always want to respond to it, and so they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with the people. They don't want to deal with their issues. Um, there's this um, sort of what is termed in emergency management as elite panic, where the elites in a society, though, and that could be politicians, that could be a majority ethnic group or a majority. cultural group or a majority racial group, or some group or set of groups with power um, will panic because they see another group
Mhm.
as a threat to them in some way, and so it's um, and so they will be the opposite. They will not be altruistic. They will not be, and they
No.
will, either explicitly or implicitly, or maybe not even purposefully, but just through their sense of privilege, will um, promote that and make it pervasive among those that support them, to blame or target a particular group of people as being to blame. I mean, this has occurred in the United States even after Hurricane Katrina, which was, we would term it a catastrophe. It was a huge regional event, you know, that caused major damage to many communities and across a region. Um, and you had, people from New Orleans that moved to Houston, and um, you had pro social behavior at first, where people were feeling um, positive about people coming. They were willing to help them, but then as time
Mhm.
passed, that faded away, and you started to have government or law enforcement or other people with authorities start to um, lay the blame on, oh, it's these refugees or these evacuees from New Orleans that came to Houston, and that's why we're having more crime, or that's why we're having more of this or more of that. So that can really, happen in these humanitarian
Mhm.
crises, where people want to build walls and not even let them in, you know, and
Mhm.
and blame them and say they're going to be a problem. We can't deal with them. We don't want to help them. And I hate it. Um, Unfortunately, that's a reality, and it's still a real challenge to figure out, how do you get around that? How do you circumvent that and try to um, get people to be um, more sympathetic and empathetic to other groups of people, when what they're facing is not what you're facing, so yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll have to get over our selfish nature en masse before we can expect any change in the world. That's really the crux of the matter, is selfishness. Hey, Nick, there was a question that just came in and it said, do you think we could interview some people in your class about their experiences with climate change in their countries?
Per Maybe. I mean, you'll see everyone. My program is very busy. Although I know one of my fellow PhD students, he's from the Bahamas, and so he's had a lot of experience dealing with the hurricanes in the Bahamas, including most recently Hurricane Dorian.
Mm.
He's talking about the experience with um, government and government response in Dorian, and the unrealistic expectations they had of themselves, the people, paper planning, where they wrote very nice plans, bureaucratic plans, but didn't actually have a very good response, and obviously the actual impacts and the damage that resulted from Dorian. So he's been an interesting guy to sort of listen to, and I know he's talked about um, how climate change is affecting the Bahamas. So he's been an interesting guy to talk to.
Mhm.
But yeah, I know it's yeah. I mean the the variety of people in the program does definitely give some perspective on various issues. He's the only one to talk specifically about climate change, but on issues of of disasters and government and people's behavior and how they view the future. It's been definitely a interesting to get to know people from different places.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Well, I always think that travel or exposure to other cultures is one of the absolute best education that you can have. And I work with a lot of people from different countries every single day, and it's always interesting to share their perspective and understand the challenges that they have in their country specifically. So,
Yeah, yeah, we're
anyway,
yeah,
um,
Americans are very American centric, so so it's definitely good to
oh,
get
no
different
kidding,
perspectives,
really?
different resources. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nick, do you, have any other things that you might want to add before we tie up this, event tonight?
Uh, Not really. I mean, I have plans for the future. I'm trying to. I applied for an internship with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for next summer. Paid internship
They're
and
they're
do it
they're
where we
based
do
in,
research.
Boulder, Colorado. Did you know that? That
Yeah,
the
yeah, they have.
National Center for Atmospheric Research, they have a big office in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh yeah, yeah, and yeah, and then they have all their have like their main headquarters in Maryland too. I'm
Oh,
hoping
yeah.
the internship will be remote, just because my fiance is disabled, so it would be like 10 weeks if I went away somewhere. It'd be it's a 10-week internship, so I'd rather not be gone for 10 weeks from North Dakota. Um, but yeah, there's definitely that, and then I also got awarded a travel grant to attend the American Meteorological Society annual conference at the end of January. So where I can get my travel costs and hotel costs and conference fee paid for. So that was a big deal because that's like $1,500 worth of stuff. So they were going to pay for all that, and I'll be able to go and learn about what's going on in the meteorology community in terms of research that's relevant to emergency management issues, and also present my perspective on things to some of those scientists out there as it relates to emergency management and obviously some of the things we've discussed, significant weather events and climate change and humanitarian issues, so those things will be very important to talk about and stuff. So I'm looking forward to going there, and so yeah,
Yeah.
I got things going on, so I'll keep everyone updated. I don't really write on my Patreon very much anymore. I admit,
Yeah.
but the money that people do provide through there. A lot of those people follow me on Facebook on my Facebook weather and climate page, Meteorologist Nick Humphrey. So the money does help, as I'm a poor college student. So I do appreciate it, and I appreciate people chiming in, and I still try to share some weather and climate stuff that's going on when I have the opportunity. And yeah, so I'm doing things, trying to move up in the world a little bit while it's still civilization's still in some state of intactness. And we'll see how long that lasts.
Yeah. Well, it's great to see you again, Nick. I'm so happy that you were able to make some time and come and
Mhm.
join us tonight on Environmental Coffee House. Hope to see you again soon, too.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, I'll try to keep track of what's going on with the cop, and obviously in a few months I'll be at the AMS meeting, so I'll be able to. I can always report on anything I learned there too, relevant to climate change and emergency management. So yeah, yeah, I'm looking forward to coming back at some point again in the next few months, hopefully.
All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. It's been a good show with Nick and catching up with him and all his activities and reviewing the abrupt climate change events that continue to unfold.
Yeah, it's nice being here and nice to talk to everybody today.
All right. Bye bye.